All right, welcome to the second episode of the series of blogcasts, if you will, where I am discussing the fundamental laws of logic. Now, there are a lot of misconceptions about what logic is and what it can pertain to, and that's kind of the reason why I decided to create this particular episode. Now, I'm going to talk about what it isn't. Logic is not the study of the universe and how it works. That is called science. Logic isn't the study of whether or not there is or is not a god, or there is or is not supernatural activity. That is called metaphysics. Logic is not how to be a good person and how not to be a good person and argue reasoningly about what is good and what isn't good. That is ethics. Now, what logic is the means to craft the arguments that you need for the other activities. Logic alone doesn't derive you into any sort of conclusion. It is merely a means to base an argument, the classical study of how to formulate an argument that is logically sound and logically relevant. Now, how do we do this? Logic uses the concept of argument and proposition. Now, what is an argument? An argument is a set of premises based on assumptions that are created within the logical model. Now, what that means, since I see a couple of you guys scratching your heads potentially, that means you put forth a postulation based on what is either observed or what is mentally constructed that makes sense. And you go, okay, if this is A, and A follows B, and B follows C, then A is the predecessor to C. And that's a very basic argument model. Now, in that particular model, I used propositions. Propositions are basically declarative statements that contain a truth value. It's something that can be evaluated as either true or not true. As in, does A really follow B, or does B really follow A? And if A does not really follow B, then the statement is false. However, you can evaluate it as true or false, is what makes a proposition a proposition. Now, there are three types of logic, two of which I'm going to go over, one of which I'm going to hint upon, because the latter is primarily an abstract type of concept. Informal logic is the study of natural language arguments, which is, the arguments you have at, like, your bar, your whatever, in your daily life. That is basically what informal logic is. Now, formal logic is a little bit different. It's the study of inference with a purely formal content based on the structure of the argument, and ignoring the content of the argument. Now, I spat that out as a textbook definition, but I'm going to kind of describe and explain what I mean by that. When you create an argument, you are coming from a point of reference. Usually, it is an inferred type of concept based on what is conceived as true or what you want to argue as true. Now, formal logic basically deals with the structure of how you create that argument, meaning that how you structure the argument is entirely the basis on which the argument is evaluated as either a good or a bad argument. So the whole basis and worth of your argument is based on how you structure it. There's also a third type of logic, which is called symbolic logic, and as you can gain from the meaning, symbolic, it uses logic as an expression of symbols. It's more of an abstract study of logic, and I'm not going to really talk about it in this particular blogcast. Now, we're going to talk about logical concepts, and there are three ways that arguments are, invalidated or validated based on the three fundamental criterion that we look for in a logical concept. And that's one, consistency, which means that none of the theorems or the premises in the model of the system contradict each other, meaning that you don't have statement 2 being a gross refutation of the first statement. That's logically unsound. The second criterion on which we determine the validity of an argument is soundness. Soundness is the system's rules of derivation won't allow false inferences if you're making truth statements. So what that means is that no part of the premise contains statements that are not true by nature, meaning that in one of your statements, you don't outright use a false statement to expand upon your argument. That's logically unsound. The third aspect of an ideal logical concept, and I use ideal, and I'll explain upon that in a second, which means that no true sentences in the system cannot be proved using the derivation rules of the system. And what that essentially means is that the system model cannot be proved through logic alone, but it is a sound argument because of how it is constructed. Which, if you think about it, is kind of weird, and you're probably asking yourself, then why do we even use logic as a means of understanding reason and behavior? And to which I said before, remember when I said that logic in itself does not prove anything aside from whether or not the argument that you're trying to make is sound and solid? Well, there you go. It's very rare that an argument has the application of all three of these logical concepts. So an argument that encapsulates all of these three concepts is very rare, if not non-existent. So it's kind of an ideal to strive for, where you try to contain as much of these logical concepts as possible within your argument structure. Now, there are two types of reasoning within the classical logical structure, and that is deductive reasoning and inductive reasoning. And they don't actually mean what you think it means. And I'm going to explain that. Deductive reasoning is based on Aristotle's axioms of classical logic. I'm going to talk about axioms later on. But how it works is that it sets up conclusions based on premises. So you formulate your premises. The traditional formulation is usually like a 3-step process. And what inductive reasoning basically means is that it's a priori in nature. What that means is that it is solely in the mind that we exercise deductive reasoning. So there's no outside observation of the world. It is pure logical construction based on the formulation of the concept in the mind. So no outside stimuli is considered. Now, one can argue that pure deductive reasoning doesn't truly exist because we are beings of environment, we are influenced by our environment, and we are influenced by our experiences within said environment. So the basis of our deductive reasoning will always carry over some kind of environmental construction. And that's true, but we're still talking about it on a purely theoretical basis. An example of this would be like the purest form of mathematics would be kind of an example of what deductive reasoning would be. Inductive reasoning, on the other hand, is the concept of probable claims based on a perceived understanding of a system. I am able to directly observe something from the outside world, and I'm able to create probable conclusions based on what I see within that environment. They, as a result, are purely empirical in nature, which means that we use our outside senses to discover truth about our universe, and we use inductive reasoning based on what we see in our universe, and we put two and two together, and we form an inductive reasoning model. Now, as a result, these models and systems are not 100% conclusive and certain because they are based on our very imperfect senses, and they are based on our imperfect understanding of the world. So they're always contestable, and they always are subject to change. An example of this is a no-brainer. It's science. Our understanding of science and our application of science is based on inductive reasoning. So the question then becomes, what is the basis for us to exercise reason? And we exercise reason through the assertion of certain axioms. Now, what axioms are, well, one, they're a priori in nature. As I've explained before what a priori is, that means that is purely a mental construct. There is no outside observation happening. We logically conclude this through the exercise of our reason alone. And what they are is that they're assumptions that we make based on self-evident facts. And those self-evident facts are needed as the basis for our logical reasoning ability. So, for an example, I am me, which means that I, as I define myself, the person that I am is myself. That's the concept of the law of identity. And the law of identity is an axiom that we use within logical structure. And what the law of identity is simply saying is that A is A, so that everything that is itself is itself. The law of excluded middle sets up a Boolean variable, which means that either it is A or it is not A. That means that I am either myself or I am not myself. Very simple concept. And what that is a formulation of a tautology. Now, what a tautology is it's a formula or a statement in which the concept is true in every interpretation of the argument. So, in every possible conceived, application of the argument where I say I am myself, it is considered true in every application of that particular statement. And that brings us to our last concept, which is the law of non-contradiction. Note that these are all axioms. These are all self-evident truths that anyone that hasn't actually studied logic formally can just say, oh yeah, that's absolutely true. And the law of non-contradiction is simply stating that nothing can be both A and not A, which means I can't be both myself and not myself. That doesn't make any sense. Now we move on to how we construe what is a good argument, what isn't a good argument, based on additional attributes or virtues of the argument. And I use virtues in heavy quotation marks. And the first aspect of it is validity. And what validity is that it's the formal characteristics of an argument. So validity is concerned about the clarity and the carrying of the premises of the logic to its proper conclusion. So, for example, consider the following. Some mammals are people. Some people live in New York. There is an elephant in my closet. Now, as you can obviously see, there are many times in which the logical statement is invalidated on multiple accounts. Now consider the following statement. I once met a man from Arkansas. The man from Arkansas had Tourette's. Therefore, I bet all people from Arkansas have Tourette's. Now, just because my conclusion is way out there doesn't mean that the argument itself is invalid. Which brings me to my next attribute of validity. Just because an argument is valid doesn't necessarily mean the conclusion is true. The second aspect of an argument is soundness. Now, what that means is if an argument is valid, then the argument can be contested on terms of truth by examining the truth values of the premises. So, what that means is that if the previous statements that build up to the conclusion are accepted as true, then the conclusion itself must also be accepted. As you can tell from my previous statement about the man from Arkansas that had Tourette's, just because the argument is valid doesn't necessarily mean it's sound. The next attribute of an argument is strength. Now, arguments can be considered weak or strong, and strength is determined based on the assumption that if the preceding statements are true, then the conclusion is also probably true, which means that the strength of an argument is inherent on the soundness of the argument first and foremost. But that also means that the strength of the premises fortifies the conclusion. So, depending on how strong the preceding statements up to the conclusion of the argument is, also determines the strength overall of the argument. So, I have a particular statement that we can consider for this purpose. So, I have met 99% of the citizens of Texas. All of them wear goofy hats, so it follows that the rest of the citizens wear goofy hats. Now, that argument is considered strong because of the fact that you have additional evidence supporting the strength of the prior statements. Now, whether or not it's actually based on reality and whether or not the statement itself is, inherently true outside of the structure of the argument is a different story. But it is considered a strong argument in the premise of classical logic. Now, there is an application of this structure in inductive reasoning, and we call that cogency within the study of logic. And what that means is that It basically states that the inductive argument is sound. So, what that means in terms of inductive reasoning, where we don't make 100% truth statements, we just say that the proclivity of evidence seems to point to this particular conclusion. What that means is that whether or not the premises that lead up to the conclusion have enough evidence to be considered true within the tentative model of the reality that we're talking about. So, this is the part of the podcast where I talk about how not to be a putz. And what that means in this particular context is to not make logical fallacies. And what logical fallacies are violations of the rules of logic, also utilizing logic to make unfair and untrue conclusions. What I mean by unfair and untrue are baseless conclusions that cannot be supported by logical structure and by reasoning. So there's as many types of fallacies as there are people in this world. I mean, there's a huge amount of fallacies that you can violate. I'm just going to go over a couple of them right now. The most simple, straightforward one is the argument ad numerum. What that means is this many people believe this is true, so therefore it is true. And that's a baseless argument, so don't do that. Ad populum and ad numerum arguments are absurd by their very nature. There is also my least favorite one, which is the argument from ignorance, which is I can't possibly conceive how X begets Y, so therefore Z, which means you insert a conclusion that is not followed by any sort of premises in order to establish the conclusion. You are arguing specifically out of a sense of incredulity, out of a sense of I can't possibly conceive how this could occur without Z, and insert Z for whatever, your personal Z is. There is also the logical fallacy of appealing to antiquity, which simply means that just because an idea has existed for a long period of time, it means that it's inherently true because it has withstood the test of time. Again, that is a logical fallacy because one, time is considered an independent factor and has no real basic in the logical argument structure. Two, speaking from an informal standpoint, there are many ideas that have withstood the test of time that are completely and utterly false, like the flat earth theory. And the last one I'm going to cover is the appeal to adverse consequences, which is the argument that creates a conclusion based on the assumptions of what the person wants to believe of reality. So the whole concept of the conclusion is based on the wishes of the individual asserting the conclusion. Pascal's wager is a famous example of this. And for the love of God, please don't use Pascal's wager. That has been refuted by people smarter than I over and over and over again. Just don't do it. You sound like a moron when you do it. Alright, I think that's about all I'm going to cover within this particular blogcast. I should be creating these with a little bit more frequency once I get a more regular place to create these podcasts. Anyways, this is Zoob signing out. Think for yourself.